Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Cliff from Shazzle. I had a question about imagining a next generation of network communications. And what we have now with client, the internet's all client server, everything's centrally located on the server, which is really an authoritarian dream. All your information comes to one central point. That was obviously necessary when the internet got kicked off. Now, with the client side having as much power as it does, everyone's laptop having more power than a server had 10 years ago, is it not possible, would it not be possible, I mean, it would take a lot of time, but would it not be possible to create networks where all the information stays with the user on the client side? I mean, we kind of fooled around with this as a smaller company. I mean, we can't do it, but to have an index that stays with the group members. So one group member goes off, another group member takes the index on their peer, and there would be no central point of information. All the data would remain on the clients, and the index would stay with whatever client happened, whatever community member happened to stay on there. But you have really a federal style rather than an authoritarian style of actually exchanging the information. And I understand some of the technical issues of keeping something disparate rather than centralized, and I'm not an engineer, but I'd like to ask some of the engineers, again, I don't think it's something you could get to in 2 years or 3 years, but if you imagine 15 years from now, 20 years from now, where your cell phone's going to probably have more power than a server has right now, or may, would it not be, and the cell phone's almost always on, would it not be possible to have decentralized storage of information where you don't have a central choke point and you're not going to be at the same level of risk of privacy that you have with the current client-server model?
Micah?
Sure. So that's a good question, and I think the answer is that systems like that already do exist, either in the form of just fully distributed file systems, or like an anonymous file sharing system like Freenet. The reason that we're not all using that today, really there are a few reasons. One is replication, or availability. You want to be able to access your system whether or not someone is shut off their computer for the night, who might have a copy of it, of the file that you need, or whether they're just unavailable. So there needs to be this kind of, we expect when we want a file to see that file there. If we used Google Docs and the spreadsheet that we really wanted to pull up, we couldn't get because Google says, I'm sorry, the person who has this spreadsheet is AWOL. We wouldn't want that. So there are technical ways that we can get around that with doing replication, and there are in fact file systems that do this. The second issue is one of trust. If you're going to outsource your data to a distributed storage provider, you need to make sure that the people who are storing your data are storing valid copies of it. So there are kind of integrity and authenticity mechanisms that you need to have in place. And in fact, there are in fact ways of doing this with different technology. So the technology exists out there, but it's just so much more darn convenient to go to docs.google.com and see all of your stuff in one place because it's fast and gee golly, it just works.
Jay.
Jay Stanley from ACLU. So one of the most controversial areas in cybersecurity has been the role of the NSA, and in justifying increased sort of government monitoring through things like Einstein 3. I always hear that the NSA has this secret sauce. They have these threat signatures which they have and nobody else has. And my question is, does anybody have any information about just what is the value add of the NSA? So they have all these threat signatures, and then a subset of that presumably are those that they cannot make public. And those that are actually valuable and useful. And when you get down to the core of a useful function of the NSA that can't be made public, does anybody have any information about is that real?
Michael and Liesyl.
And how big is it? Significant is it?
Well, I will say congressional offices are allowed to designate one staffer with security clearance, and I'm not that staffer. so even if
you got to work on that, Michael.
but that's where I think there's a lot of apprehension about if you would want to have NSA actively on a network, as opposed, instead of just having them focus on the .mil network. But kind of for the DIP pilot project where I was talking about it, being able to share some of those attack signatures with other companies and kind of what I guess we'll see, and it's been going for a little more than a month now, so we'll see in another 45 days or so how some of that might have played out and if it was useful at all. But as far as the specific knowledge, no.
And just to put a finer point on one comment I made earlier, which is that I think the government generally doesn't share that kind of information, even on a needed basis, with industry as much as it should. And so in order to galvanize a more robust, either preparatory or responsive engagement, we would encourage them to find ways to share more of that information, exchange more of it than they do today with the critical infrastructure providers.
And that is one thing that we have heard from them, that is where you want it to be a company's voluntary decision if they, this is going back to the kill switch, if they do want to remove a portion of their network off of the larger internet, that you want that to be a voluntary decision. But when you have the government going to an electric grid and saying, you need to shut this down, we can't tell you why, that they're going to say, well, that's not a good enough reason for me to really do it sometimes. So I think there is a need to find a way to enable to share that information so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they should voluntarily pull their own network off or not.
Yes.
Thank you. Kasia Szymilewicz, Panoptykon Foundation, Poland. Two brief questions. One, again, on corporate responsibility and private entities. I also welcome the framework, and I'm hopeful that it will bring some effect. But Susan and others, do you think that we will need at some point external enforcement mechanism for this, or can we really rely on peer-to-peer pressure or other sort of grassroots mechanisms? So what's your idea here? What are your ideas here? And the second question to our IT experts, is there any reliable research on the implications of filtering and blocking if applied to global network? I'm asking in the context of the debate we are now having with the Polish government that is considering introducing blocking, and we really need some arguments to show them the implications of that kind of system for the network. Because, you know, it's all about balancing. They say we can sort some of the threats by doing this, but they do not see practically how how this could affect other human rights. For example, access to information. So I'm looking for some data or arguments to show them that filtering and blocking does not come at no price, even if it's done pristinely.
Before folks endeavor to answer, tell us a little bit about what the government of Poland is proposing in terms of filtering and blocking.
Well, it's done in the context of EU debate on net blocking as regards child pornography sites. There is a big debate now concerning one legislation that is underway. It's called the Directive on Fighting Child Sexual Exploitation, and one of the solutions proposed there is blocking. There will be a long time before it gets implemented, but the debate happens now. So now we need arguments to show them that blocking not only is not effective, not only threatens freedom of speech, but also threatens internet and other freedoms that can be performed online. So we really need more research and data on this. Thank you.
So, on the first question around corporate responsibility and whether there will need to be any enforcement mechanisms, I think certainly from a GNI perspective, I would see the process that we have of independent assessment and verification that we will publicly report on as being kind of an enforcement mechanism in its way, and that there will be transparency and public accountability of the actions that the companies are taking and the impact that that's having. So that's in respect to GNI. In respect to the broader Protect, Respect and Remedy framework, I think it's only a couple of weeks since the final framework and the accompanying guidelines went to the UN Human Rights Council. And I think we're still sort of waiting for the official announcement of how it was received. So I think it's probably too early to see what the mechanisms might be that come about around that framework. I guess we'll see that in time, but it seems to me that it's too early at this stage. But the fact that there's now a framework and there's a set of guiding principles in place, it seems to me is a really big step. I'd just like to touch upon the question, less about the filtering part, but the the part of the question dealing with getting other countries to take certain behavior or actions. Is that correct? As you may know, the U.S. government, the White House, issued its international strategy for cyberspace on May 16th, and it deals with sort of a very overarching framework and goals and objectives for cyberspace, not just cybersecurity, but also cyber freedoms and privacy and sort of all the things you all are talking about this week. So I commend that to you. But one part of it is how to develop norms in cyberspace, norms of behavior by countries, and how they interact or react or behave in the global community on cyberspace. So I think that's a new thing for this administration, certainly coming from the White House and Department of State. So I commend that to you.
Thank you.
Can I address your filter? Okay. So let me address kind of the filtering aspect of, or the filtering part of that question. So one aspect is are these systems effective in a country like Poland? And I'd argue that they're probably not going to be for someone who's very determined and knowledgeable to get around them. And in fact, there are several censorship countermeasures or censorship-resistant systems out there, Tor being kind of the canonical example. And it's a great thing that these systems are out there for a number of reasons, but they also allow, unfortunately, people to access illicit or illegal content. So, a government filtering, even if it's using DPI or the latest kind of technology, isn't going to be very effective against these countermeasures, unless you actively try to block these censorship-resistant countermeasures, which is just generally speaking a very bad idea. So there's also the question of the cost of doing this, and so it reminds me of kind of a story that happened in February of this year, where DHS decided that they were going to take down some child pornography sites. And they did this by blocking IP addresses and DNS names. And that sounds like perhaps a very good thing, but one of the things that they managed to do is to take down freedns.org, which is a website or DNS provider for a lot of companies. And what ends up happening is they accidentally blocked 84,000 websites that had nothing to do with child pornography. And when you went to these websites, you saw a big notice that said, this website has been taken down by the DHS, and then it cited some statute about how child pornography is illegal. So you can imagine that if you're one of these businesses operating off of these websites, that probably isn't a good thing. And this was an innocent mistake. And in fact, I would fathom that there was probably a website that was, serving child pornography that belonged to, the free DNS system, and it's just that they tried to hit this nail with a sledgehammer, and it took down an awful lot of sites, and it took several days for this DNS blocking to be countered. And I don't know what happened to these people's businesses, but they probably aren't using free DNS anymore.